This is HOA anger. The HOA made it personal, and I made it documented. She was standing at the end of my driveway with a clipboard and a roll of caution tape, pointing at the snow berm the HOA plow crew had pushed back into my cleared space for the third time that week, and she said, "You are in violation of snow clearance standards under Section 4.12. You have 24 hours to remove this hazard, or we will fine you $200 per day and authorize a tow if your vehicle obstructs emergency access." I am a building inspector. I know the difference between actual code and HOA nonsense. I moved to Portland, Oregon 2 years ago for the job and bought a townhouse in the Heights at Northwind because the commute was short and the price was right. The association runs this neighborhood like a leverage game, not a community. Rules are tools, and the people who enforce them treat every interaction like a chance to remind you who is in charge. I need my car every single day. I drive to site inspections across the metro, and if they tow me, I lose work, I lose credibility, and I lose the ability to pick up my sister from her shift before the roads ice over. That is the stake here. My independence, my income, and my family. The first sign of trouble was a notice taped to my door 3 days after the first snowstorm. It said I had failed to clear my walkway within 12 hours of snowfall. I had cleared it. I had photos with timestamps. But the notice included a picture taken from an angle that made it look like I had left a hazard. The photo was shot inches from my property line, angled to catch the shadow of a berm the plow had shoved onto my grass. It looked bad if you did not know the context. That was the point. The woman holding the clipboard now is Kathleen Martinez. Everyone calls her Sharon, but her name is Kathleen, and she is the HOA president. She has red shoulder-length straight hair, a purple belted wool coat, white earmuffs, and a tow yard claim ticket booklet she flips through like it is a weapon. She loves this. You can see it in the way she stands with her weight forward, her breath fogging in the freezing air, her fingers tight on that roll of caution tape. She said, "You think this is petty? I think this is my purpose." I said, "I cleared this driveway yesterday. Your plow crew pushed that berm back in at 6 this morning. I watched it happen." She said, "Then you should have cleared it again. The covenants require continuous compliance. If snow accumulates, you are responsible." I said, "The covenants do not say that." She said, "I have been on this board for 8 years. I know what they say." I said, "Section 4.12 is about ice hazards on walkways, not snow pushed by HOA contractors." She said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." That line stuck with me. Make it public. She thought I would not. She thought I would fold. I kept my hands open and my voice calm, because the real move was still ahead. I said, "I will see you at the hearing." She said, "There is no hearing unless you request one in writing within 48 hours, and even then, the board decides if your request is valid." I said, "I know the process." She smiled, turned, and walked back toward her SUV, the caution tape dangling from her hand like a victory flag. The berm sat there, a 3-foot wall of icy slush that I would have to move again before I could get my car out. I went inside, made coffee, and started pulling documents. I had the covenants, conditions, and restrictions on my laptop. I had the county snow emergency ordinances. I had the HOA contract with the plow vendor. I had my own photos from every storm this season, time-stamped and geotagged. And I had something else. A text thread from a neighbor who works maintenance for the HOA landscape contractor. He had told me 2 weeks ago that Kathleen was asking vendors to stage compliance photos to make certain properties look worse than they were. He said she wanted ammunition for enforcement. He did not want to get involved, but he also did not want to see someone get screwed. I told him I would protect his name. He sent me a screenshot. The screenshot showed Kathleen instructing the vendor to take a photo of my driveway at an angle that would hide the fact that I had cleared the walk, and to adjust the timestamp metadata so it looked like the photo was taken an hour earlier than it actually was. That was falsification. That was fraud. That was my trump card, and I was not going to play it until she forced me into a corner where it would hurt the most. I spent the rest of the morning shoveling the berm. My hands were numb even with gloves. The snow was heavy, wet, and packed hard by the plow blade. Every shovelful felt like lifting concrete. A maintenance worker in a reflective vest stood by the mailboxes 50 feet away watching. He did not help. He did not say anything. He just watched. That is the culture here. People see what happens, but they do not step in unless it benefits them. By noon, I had the driveway clear again. I took photos. I uploaded them to a cloud folder. I sent a formal written request for a hearing to the HOA management company, copying Kathleen and the rest of the board. I cited the specific covenant section, the county ordinance that contradicts the HOA interpretation, and a polite demand that they provide the unedited metadata for any compliance photos they plan to use as evidence. That last part was bait. I wanted to see if she would panic. She did. At 2 in the afternoon, I got a call from the management company. The woman on the phone said the board had reviewed my request and determined that my violation was clear and did not require a hearing. I said, "The covenants guarantee a hearing for any dispute over fines or enforcement actions." She said, "The board has discretion to deny frivolous requests." I said, "This is not frivolous, and if you deny me due process, I will file a complaint with the state and request a full audit of HOA records under Oregon Public Records Law." She paused. She said, "Hold on." I heard muffled voices. She came back and said, "The board will schedule a hearing for next Monday at 7. I said, "Thank you." She hung up. That gave me 5 days. 5 days to gather everything, lock down my ally, and make sure my evidence was airtight. The time pressure was real. My sister works evenings at a care facility across town, and her shift ends at 9. The roads ice over hard after sunset. If I had to stay late at a hearing, or if Kathleen tried to delay me with procedural games, I would miss the window to pick her up safely. She does not drive in winter weather. She depends on me. Kathleen knew that. I had mentioned it once in passing at a neighborhood meeting months ago. She remembered everything. I called my ally. His name is Dan. He lives 3 doors down. He is retired. He sits near the front at every HOA meeting, and he records everything on his phone. He does not trust the board, and he has been collecting his own archive of bad decisions and contradictions for 2 years. I told him what was happening. I told him about the screenshot. I told him I needed him to be my witness. He said, "I will be there, and I will bring my own files." Kathleen has been pulling this garbage on other people too. You are not the first. That was the validation I needed. This was not personal paranoia. This was a pattern. The next day, another notice appeared on my door. This one said I had failed to remove ice from my front steps and that the HOA was authorizing a vendor to come by without notice to verify compliance and assess the hazard. I checked my steps. They were clear. I had salted them that morning. The notice included a photo. The photo showed my steps from a low angle, shot in shadow, with a patch of wet pavement that could have been ice or could have been meltwater. It was impossible to tell. But the caption said it was a slip hazard. I took my own photos. I measured the temperature. I documented the salt I had used. I sent another email to the management company, attaching the evidence and asking for the name of the vendor they planned to send. No reply. At 4 in the afternoon, a truck pulled up. 2 men got out. One had a clipboard, the other had a camera. I opened the door. I said, "Can I help you?" The man with the clipboard said, "We are here to inspect your property for compliance with HOA safety standards." I said, "Do you have a warrant?" He said, "We do not need one. This is HOA property." I said, "This is my property, and you do not have my permission to be here." He said, "The HOA authorized this inspection." I said, "Show me the authorization in writing." He hesitated. He pulled out a printed email on HOA letterhead. It was signed by Kathleen. It said the vendor was authorized to inspect and photograph any exterior areas to verify compliance with covenants. I took a picture of the email with my phone. I said, "I am not letting you on my property without a formal notice period as required by state law." He said, "You are obstructing HOA business." I said, "I am protecting my rights. If you step on my property without my consent, I will call the police." He looked at his partner. They got back in the truck and left. I called Dan. I told him what happened. He said, "She is trying to provoke you into doing something she can use against you. Do not give her anything." I said, "I know." He said, "I talked to a few other neighbors. 3 people have gotten the same treatment this winter. One guy got fined for parking his car under a cover during freezing rain. Kathleen called it an unapproved structure. Another woman got fined for not clearing a berm that the HOA plow pushed onto her property. It is the same playbook every time. That night, I went through the covenants line by line. I found the section Kathleen had cited. Section 4.12. It said property owners must clear walkways of ice within 12 hours of snowfall to prevent slip hazards. It said nothing about snow berms. It said nothing about plowed snow. It said nothing about vendor inspections. I printed the section. I highlighted the relevant text. I attached it to a demand letter that I planned to send to the board before the hearing. The letter would force them to respond in writing, and once they responded, I would have their interpretation on record. If they lied or twisted the language, I would have proof. The hearing was set for Monday at 7. I spent the weekend preparing. I printed every photo. I printed every email. I printed the screenshot of Kathleen instructing the vendor to falsify the timestamp. I put everything in a binder with tabs. I made copies. One for me, one for Dan, one for the board, and one for the management company. I wanted no confusion about what I had and when I had it. On Sunday afternoon, the plow crew came through again. I was in the kitchen when I heard the scrape of the blade. I looked out the window. The driver was pushing a fresh berm directly into my driveway, even though my driveway was already clear. I grabbed my phone and recorded it. The driver saw me. He kept going. He finished the pass, then stopped, backed up, and pushed a second load into the same spot. It was deliberate. It was targeted. When he was done, the berm was 4 feet high and spanned the entire width of my driveway. My car was blocked in. I went outside. I said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "I was told to clear the street." I said, "You just buried my driveway." He said, "Take it up with the HOA." He drove off. I called the management company. I left a message. I called Kathleen directly. No answer. I sent an email with the video attached. I said, "Your contractor just intentionally blocked my driveway after I had already cleared it. This is harassment, and I am documenting it for the hearing." I hit send. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Kathleen. She said, "You are accusing our contractor of harassment." I said, "I have video proof." She said, "He was doing his job. If your driveway is blocked, that is your responsibility to clear." I said, "He pushed snow into a space that was already clear." She said, "The street has to be passable. Your driveway is not our priority. I said, your covenants require reasonable accommodation for property owners. Deliberately blocking access is not reasonable. She said, we will discuss this at the hearing. She hung up. I spent 2 hours shoveling that berm. My back ached. My hands were raw. A hand warmer packet I had shoved in my pocket earlier was crumpled in my fist, long since cold. I kept working. By the time I finished, it was dark, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. Black ice was forming on the pavement. I salted everything. I took more photos. I went inside and collapsed on the couch. Monday came fast. I got to the HOA meeting room at 6:45. It was a small conference room in the clubhouse, fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a long table at the front. Kathleen was already there with 2 other board members. Dan was sitting in the second row with his phone on the table in front of him, recording light on. A few other neighbors were scattered in the back. The maintenance worker in the reflective vest was standing by the door, watching. Kathleen called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. She said, we are here to address a compliance dispute filed by the property owner at Unit 42. The issue is failure to maintain snow clearance and ice removal standards under Section 4.12 of the covenants. She looked at me. She said, you have 10 minutes to present your case. I stood up. I said, I am disputing the violation because the evidence you provided is false and the interpretation of the covenant is incorrect. I opened my binder. I said, Section 4.12 requires property owners to clear walkways of ice within 12 hours of snowfall. It says nothing about snow berms pushed onto private property by HOA contractors. I handed copies of the covenant section to the board. I said, the photo you used in your notice was taken at an angle that misrepresents the condition of my walkway. I have time-stamped photos proving I cleared the walkway within the required time. I handed those over. Kathleen said, the board has discretion to interpret compliance. I said, the board does not have discretion to falsify evidence. I pulled out the screenshot. I said, I have proof that you instructed a vendor to alter the timestamp on a compliance photo to make it appear I was in violation when I was not. I handed copies to Dan first, then placed copies in front of the board. Kathleen's face went white. One of the other board members said, what is this? I said, it is a text message from the vendor showing that the president ordered them to manipulate evidence. The room went silent. Dan said, I have been recording HOA meetings for 2 years, and I have documented 3 other cases where property owners were targeted with staged photos and selective enforcement. If this goes to arbitration or court, I will provide everything I have. Kathleen said, this is out of context. I said, the context is clear. You abused your authority to create a violation that did not exist. That is fraud. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with gray hair, said, Kathleen, did you send this message? She said, I was ensuring accurate documentation. He said, by asking a vendor to change a timestamp. She said, the vendor made a mistake. I was correcting it. I said, a correction would involve taking a new photo with the correct time. Altering metadata is falsification. The third board member, a woman in a fleece jacket, said, we need to table this and consult with our attorney. I said, I am also requesting a full public records audit of all compliance enforcement actions taken under this board, including vendor contracts, photo metadata, and correspondence. I am filing that request under Oregon Public Records Law. If you refuse, I will escalate to the state. Kathleen said, you cannot do that. I said, I already did. I filed it this afternoon. You have 7 business days to respond. She stood up. She said, this meeting is over. The gray-haired board member said, "No, it is not. Sit down." She sat. He said, "We are voting on this violation right now. All in favor of dismissing the fine and the enforcement action, raise your hand." He raised his hand. The woman in the fleece jacket raised hers. Kathleen did not move. He said, "Motion passes. The fine is dismissed. The enforcement action is voided. Meeting adjourned." Kathleen grabbed her things and stormed out. The roll of caution tape fell from her bag and unrolled across the floor. No one picked it up. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos and justice. Dan walked out with me. He said, "That was beautiful." I said, "It is not over. She is going to retaliate." He said, "Let her try. We have everything documented now." The retaliation came faster than I expected. The next morning, I got an email from the management company. It said the board had reviewed my vehicle placement and determined that my car was in violation of emergency access standards. I was being given 48 hours to move it, or the HOA would authorize a tow. I looked out the window. My car was parked in my assigned spot, fully within the lines, not blocking anything. The email included a photo. The photo showed my car from an angle that made it look like it was slightly over the curb line. It was not. I measured. I took photos. I sent a reply disputing the claim. That afternoon, Kathleen showed up at my door. She said, "You made a big mistake embarrassing me in front of the board." I said, "You made the mistake falsifying evidence." She said, "You think you won, but you just made yourself a target. Every time you step out of line, I will be watching." I said, "I have been in line the whole time. You are the one breaking rules." She said, "You think this is petty. I think this is my purpose." She turned and walked away. I called Dan. I told him about the tow threat. He said, "She is trying to push you into a confrontation where she can call the police or get you on camera doing something aggressive. Do not engage. Let it play out." I said, "I cannot let them tow my car." He said, "They would not dare. Not after what just happened." I said, "She is desperate. Desperate people do stupid things." I was right. The next night, I came home from a site inspection at 8. My sister's shift ended at 9. I had an hour to get across town. When I pulled into the neighborhood, I saw a tow truck parked at the curb near my unit. The driver was standing by my car with a hook in his hand. Kathleen was standing next to him with a clipboard and a tow authorization slip, pointing at my car and talking fast. I parked across the street and got out. I said, "What is going on?" The driver said, "HOA authorized a tow for code violation." I said, "There is no code violation." I pulled out my phone. I pulled up the photos I had taken that morning showing my car fully within the marked space. I said, "Look at this. My car is legal." The driver looked at the photos. He looked at Kathleen. He said, "Ma'am, this does not look like a violation." Kathleen said, "The board has determined it is." The driver said, "I need something more solid than that. I am not hooking a car based on a judgment call." Kathleen pulled out the authorization slip and shoved it in his face. She said, "This is your authorization. Do your job." The driver said, "I am not risking a lawsuit over a disputed spot." He put the hook back in the truck. Kathleen said, "I will report you to your company." He said, "Go ahead." He got in the truck and drove off. Kathleen turned to me. Her face was red. She said, "You think you are clever." I said, "I think I follow the rules." She said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." I said, "You already said that. Maybe you should take your own advice." I pulled out a second copy of the screenshot and handed it to her. I said, "This is going to the state HOA ombudsman tomorrow, unless you and the board drop every pending action against me and issue a formal apology on the record at the next meeting." Her hand shook. She said, "You are bluffing." I said, "Try me." She crumpled the paper and threw it on the ground. She walked to her car, got in, and drove off. I picked up the crumpled paper, smoothed it out, and took a photo of it lying on the icy pavement next to the tow authorization slip she had dropped. Evidence. I got in my car and drove to pick up my sister. The roads were bad. Black ice everywhere. I made it with 10 minutes to spare. On the way back, I told her what had happened. She said, "You need to be careful. People like that do not stop." I said, "I know, but I am not backing down." The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the state. I attached the screenshot, the photos, the video of the plow crew blocking my driveway, the emails, and a written statement from Dan. I requested an investigation into fraudulent enforcement practices and a review of the board's authority under Oregon HOA law. 2 days later, the management company called. The woman on the phone said the board had voted to drop all pending enforcement actions against me and to issue a public apology at the next general meeting. I said, "I want it in writing." She said, "You will receive a letter by the end of the week." I said, "And I want the apology to include an acknowledgement that evidence was falsified." She paused. She said, "I will pass that along." The letter arrived on Friday. It was short. It said the board had reviewed the matter and determined that errors were made in the documentation and interpretation of covenant compliance. All fines and enforcement actions were voided. A formal apology would be issued at the next meeting. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. I showed up early. Dan was already there. So were a dozen other neighbors. Word had spread. Kathleen was sitting at the front table, stiff and silent. The gray-haired board member opened the meeting. He said, "We are here to address errors in recent enforcement actions. The board acknowledges that documentation used in certain cases was inaccurate and that enforcement was applied inconsistently. We apologize to affected property owners and commit to reviewing our processes." He looked at Kathleen. He said, "The board president has a statement." Kathleen stood. Her face was tight. She read from a card. She said, "I apologize for errors in judgment and documentation. I take responsibility." She sat down. It was not enough. A woman in the back stood up. She said, "Are you going to explain what the errors were?" The gray-haired board member said, "Specific details are part of an ongoing review." The woman said, "We deserve to know if the board falsified evidence." The room erupted. People were shouting. Dan stood up. He said, "I have recordings of 3 other cases where similar tactics were used. If the board does not commit to transparency and accountability, I will release everything publicly." The gray-haired board member said, "We will schedule a special meeting to discuss governance reforms." Kathleen stood up. She said, "I resign." She grabbed her bag and walked out. The room went quiet. The woman in the fleece jacket said, "I resign too." The gray-haired board member sat alone at the table. He said, "We will hold elections for new board members next month." Meeting adjourned. People stayed and talked for an hour. Dan introduced me to the woman who had spoken up. Her name was Lisa. She said, "I got hit with a bogus fine last year for leaving my trash can out 15 minutes past pickup. I paid it because I did not want the fight. I wish I had known you were dealing with this too." I said, "We need to make sure the new board does not pull the same garbage." She said, "I am running. So is Dan. We need people who actually care about the community, not the power." That night, I got a call from the management company. The woman on the phone said the HOA was formally dropping all investigations and waiving any fees associated with the dispute. She said the board had also agreed to audit vendor contracts and implement a policy requiring written notice before any compliance inspections. I said, "Good." She said, "We apologize for the inconvenience." I said it was not an inconvenience, it was harassment. The plow crew came through one more time that week. The driver waved at me as he passed. The berm he left was small and off to the side, nowhere near my driveway. 2 weeks later, Lisa and Dan both won seats on the new board. The first thing they did was pass a resolution requiring all compliance photos to include unaltered metadata and a second witness. The second thing they did was terminate the contract with the vendor who had been staging photos. The third thing they did was send a letter to every property owner explaining the reforms and inviting feedback. Kathleen moved out 3 months later. I heard she bought a condo in a building with no HOA. The neighborhood is different now. People talk to each other. When someone gets a notice, they ask questions. When the board makes a decision, they explain it. It is not perfect, but it is better. I still shovel my driveway after every storm. I still take photos. I still keep records. Not because I expect trouble, but because I learned that the only way to deal with people who weaponize rules is to know the rules better than they do. The roll of caution tape is still sitting in a box in my garage. I kept it as a reminder. Not of the fight, but of the fact that I won it without breaking a single rule. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.